Chapter 1, Part 8, of the Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, by William Cooper Nell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by the Progressing America Project. The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. Chapter 1, continued. Massachusetts. Paul Cuffe. Paul Cuffe's father was a native of Africa, whence, at an early age, he was dragged by the unfeeling hand of avarice from his home and connections, torn from the parental roof and everything in this world that was near and dear to him, transported over the wide and trackless ocean, many thousand miles from the land of his birth, to be forever consigned to rigorous and cruel bondage. Quote, "To increase a stranger's treasures, o'er the raging billows borne." He was purchased as a slave by a person named Slocum, residing in Massachusetts, one of the United States of North America, by whom he was kept in slavery a considerable portion of his life, and there is no reason to doubt, had it not been for his laudable enterprise, aided by great perseverance, he would have worn out his life in perpetual bondage, and ended his days, like many of his degraded and unjustly oppressed fellow countrymen, under the galling yoke of fetters and chains, or the smart inflicted by the whip of an unrelenting driver. Being possessed, however, of a mind far superior to his degraded and unhappy condition, he was always diligent in his master's business, and proved himself in numerous instances faithful to his interests, so that, by unremitting industry and economy, he was enabled, after a considerable length of time, under the blessing of a kind Providence, to procure the means for purchasing his personal liberty, of which he had been deprived, as already stated, in very early life. According to the custom of the country into which he was transported, Cuffee also received the name of Slocum, as expressing to whom he belonged, though it appears in after life he was known by the name of John Cuffee. Soon after the happy period in which Cuffee effected his emancipation, and succeeded in releasing himself from the bonds of slavery and unjust oppression, he became acquainted with Ruth Moses, an honorable woman, descended from one of the Indian tribes residing in Massachusetts. Cuffee's acquaintance with Ruth Moses ended in their taking each other in marriage, and continuing in his praiseworthy habits of industry and frugality, he was enabled, soon after this occurrence, to purchase a farm of 100 acres of land in Westport, Massachusetts. Cuffee and Ruth continued to live happily together, and brought up a family of 10 children, 4 sons and 6 daughters. 3 of the former, David, Jonathan, and John, were farmers in the neighborhood of Westport, filled respectable stations in society, and were endowed with good intellectual capabilities. They all married well, and gave their children a good education. Cuffee died in 1745, leaving behind him a considerable property in land, the fruits of his industry. Paul, the youngest son of Cuffee, and the interesting subject of the present memoir, was born on Cutterhunker, one of the Elizabeth Islands, near New Bedford, in the year 1759, so that, when his father died, he was about 14 years of age, at which time he had learned but little more than the letters of the alphabet. The land which his father had left behind him proving unproductive, afforded but little provision for the numerous family, so that the care of supporting his mother and sisters devolved jointly upon himself and his brothers. Thus he labored under great disadvantages, being deprived of the means and opportunity for acquiring even the rudiments of a good education. He was not, however, easily to be discouraged, and found opportunities of improving himself in various ways, and cultivating his mind. Having never received the benefits of an education, the knowledge he possessed was obtained entirely by his own indefatigable exertions, and the little assistance which he occasionally received from persons who were friendly disposed towards him. Aided by these means, he soon learned to read and write, and he also attained to a considerable proficiency in arithmetic and skill in navigation, and we may form some estimate of the natural talent with which he was endowed for the speedy reception of learning, from the fact that, with the assistance of a friend, he acquired such a knowledge of the latter science, in the short space of 2 weeks, as enabled him to command the vessel in the voyages which he subsequently made to England, to Russia, to Africa, and to the West Indies, as well as to several different ports in the southern section of the United States. It has already been stated that his 3 brothers were respectable farmers in the neighborhood of Westport. The mind of Paul, however, was early inclined to the pursuits of commerce. Conceiving that they furnished to industry more ample rewards than agriculture, and conscious that he possessed qualities which, under proper culture, would enable him to pursue commercial employments with prospects of success, he entered, at the age of 16, as a common hand, on board of a vessel destined to the Bay of Mexico on a whaling expedition. His second voyage was to the West Indies, but on his third, which was during the American War, about the year 1776, he was captured by a British ship. After 3 months' detention as a prisoner at New York, he was permitted to return home to Westport, where, owing to the unfortunate continuance of hostilities, he spent about 2 years in agricultural pursuits. During this interval, Paul and his brother, John Cuffee, were called on by the collector of the district in which they resided for the payment of a personal tax. It appeared to them that by the laws and the Constitution of Massachusetts, taxation and the whole rights of citizenship were united. If the laws demanded of them the payment of personal taxes, the same laws must necessarily and constitutionally invest them with the rights of representing, and being represented, in the state legislature. But they had never been considered as entitled to the privilege of voting at elections, or of being elected to places of trust and honor. Under these circumstances they refused to comply. The collector resorted to the force of the laws, and after many delays and vexations, Paul and his brother deemed it most prudent to silence the suit by payment of the demands, which were only small. But they resolved, if it were possible, to obtain the rights which they believed to be connected with taxation. In pursuance of this resolution, they presented a respectful petition to the state legislature, which met with a warm and almost indignant opposition from some in authority. A considerable majority, however, perceiving the propriety and justness of the petition, were favorable to the object, and with an honorable magnanimity, in defiance of the prejudice of the times, a law was enacted by them, rendering all free persons of color liable to taxation, according to the ratio established for white men, and granting them all the privileges belonging to other citizens. This was a day equally honorable to the petitioners and to the legislature, a day in which justice and humanity triumphed over prejudice and oppression, and a day which ought to be gratefully remembered by every person of color within the boundaries of Massachusetts, and the names of John and Paul Cuffe should always be united with its recollection. Paul, being at this time about 25 years of age, thought himself sufficiently skilled to enter into business on his own account, and laid before his brother David a plan for opening a commercial intercourse with the state of Connecticut. His brother was pleased with the prospect, and they built an open boat and proceeded to sea. They encountered such numerous and untoward discomfitures as would have caused the courage of most persons to fail. But Paul's dispositions were not that of yielding nature. He possessed that inflexible spirit of perseverance and firmness of mind, which entitled him to a more successful issue of his endeavors, and he believed that, while he maintained integrity of heart and conduct, he might humbly hope for the protection of Providence. Under these impressions, he prepared for another voyage. In his open boat, with a small cargo, he again directed his course towards the island of Nantucket. The weather was favorable, and he arrived in safety at the destined port, and disposed of his little cargo to advantage. The profits of this voyage, by strengthening the confidence of his friends, enabled him further to enlarge his plans, and by a steady perseverance, he was at length enabled, under divine assistance, to overcome obstacles apparently insurmountable. Having become master of a small covered vessel of about 12 tons burthen, he hired a person to assist him as a seaman, and made many advantageous voyages to different parts of the state of Connecticut, and, when about 25 years of age, he married a native of the country, and a descendant of the same tribe to which his mother belonged. For some time after his marriage, he attended chiefly to his agricultural concerns, but from an increase in family, he at length deemed it necessary to pursue his commercial undertakings more extensively than he had before done. He arranged his affairs for a new expedition, and hired a small house on Westport River, to which he removed his family. A vessel of 18 tons was now procured, in which he sailed to the banks of St. George in quest of codfish, and returned home with a valuable cargo. This important adventure was the foundation of an extensive and profitable fishing establishment from Westport River, which continued for a considerable time, and was the source of an honest and comfortable living to many of the inhabitants of that district. At this period, Paul formed a connection with his brother-in-law, Michael Wainer, who had several sons well qualified for the sea service, 4 of whom, subsequently, laudably filled responsible situations as captains and first mates. A vessel of 25 tons was built, and in 2 voyages to the Straits of Belle Isle and Newfoundland, he met with such success as enabled him, in conjunction with another person, to build a vessel of 42 tons burthen, in which he made several profitable voyages. Paul had experienced the many disadvantages of his very limited education, and he resolved, as far as it was practicable, to relieve his children from similar embarrassments. The neighborhood had neither a tutor nor a school for the instruction of youth, though many of the citizens were desirous that such an institution should be established. About 1797, Paul proposed convening a meeting of the inhabitants for the purpose of making such arrangements as should accomplish the desired object, the great utility and necessity of which was undeniable. The collision of opinion, however, respecting mode and place, occasioned the meeting to separate without arriving at any conclusion. Several meetings of the same nature were held, but all were alike unsuccessful in their issue. Perceiving that all efforts to procure a union of sentiment were fruitless, Paul, by no means disheartened, set himself to work in earnest, and had a suitable house built on his own ground, and entirely at his own expense, which he freely offered for the use of the public, without requiring any pecuniary remuneration, feeling himself fully compensated in the satisfaction he derived in seeing it occupied for so useful and excellent a purpose, and the school was open to all who pleased to send their children. How gratifying to humanity is this anecdote, and who that justly appreciates human character would not prefer Paul Cuffe, the offspring of an African slave, to the proudest statesman that ever dealt out destruction amongst mankind? About this time, Paul proceeded on a whaling voyage to the Straits of Belle Isle, where he met with 4 other vessels, completely equipped with boats and harpoons, for capturing whales. Paul discovered that he had not made proper preparations for the business, having only 10 hands on board, and 2 boats, one of which was old and almost useless. When the masters of the other vessels discovered his situation, they refused to comply with the customary practices adopted on such voyages, and refused to mate with his crew. In this emergency, Paul resolved to prosecute his undertaking alone, till, at length, the other masters thought it most prudent to accede to the usual practice, apprehending his crew, by their ignorance, might alarm and drive the whales from their reach, and thus defeat the object of their voyage. During the season, they took 7 whales. The circumstances which had taken place roused the ambition of Paul and his crew. They were diligent and enterprising, and had the honor of killing 6 of the 7 whales, 2 of which fell by Paul's own hands. He returned home in due season, heavily freighted with oil and bone, and arrived in the autumn of 1793, being then about his 34th year. He went to Philadelphia to dispose of his cargo, and found his pecuniary circumstances were by this time in a flourishing train. When in Philadelphia, he purchased iron necessary for bolts, and other work suitable for a schooner of 60 or 70 tons, and soon after his return to Westport, the keel for a new vessel was laid. In 1795, his schooner, of 60 tons burthen, was launched and called the Ranger. He also possessed 2 small fishing boats, but his money was exhausted, and the cargo of his new vessel would require a considerable sum beyond his present stock. He now sold his 2 boats, and was enabled to place on board his schooner a cargo valued at $2,000. With this he sailed to Norfolk, on the Chesapeake Bay, and there learned that a very plentiful crop of Indian corn had been gathered that year on the eastern shore of Maryland, and that he could procure a schooner load, for a low price, at Vienna, on the Nanticoke River. Thither he sailed, but on his arrival, the people were filled with astonishment and alarm. A vessel, owned and commanded by a black man, and manned with a crew of the same complexion, was unprecedented and surprising. The white inhabitants were struck with apprehensions of the injurious effects which such circumstance would have on the minds of their slaves, suspecting that he wished secretly to kindle the spirit of rebellion and excite a destructive revolt among them. Under these notions, several persons associated themselves for the purpose of preventing Paul from entering his vessel or remaining among them. On examination, his papers proved to be correct, and the custom house officers could not legally refuse the entry of his vessel. Paul combined prudence with resolution, and on this occasion conducted himself with candor, modesty, and firmness, and his crew behaved, not only inoffensively, but with a conciliating propriety. In a few days the inimical association vanished, and the inhabitants treated him and his crew with respect and even kindness. Many of the principal people visited his vessel, and in consequence of the pressing invitation of one of them, Paul dined with his family in the town. During the year 1797, after his return home, he purchased the house in which his family resided, and the adjoining farm. For the latter, including improvements, he paid $3,500, and placed it under the management of his brother, who, as stated before, was a farmer. By judicious plans, and diligence in their execution, Paul gradually increased his property, one farm covered 100 acres, and by the integrity and consistency of his conduct, he gained the esteem and regard of his fellow citizens. In the year 1800, he was concerned in one half of the expenses of building and equipping a brig of 162 tons burthen. 1/4 belonged to his brother, and the other 1/4 was owned by persons not related to his family. The brig was commanded by Thomas Wainer, Paul Cuffe's nephew, whose talents and character were perfectly adapted to such a situation. The ship Alpha, of 268 tons carpenter's measure, of which Paul owned 3/4, was built in 1806. Of this vessel he was the commander, the rest of the crew consisting of 7 men of color. The ship performed a voyage, under his command, from Wilmington to Savannah, thence to Gothenburg, and thence to Philadelphia. After Paul's return in 1806, the brig Traveler, of 109 tons burthen, was built at Westport, of one half of which he was the owner. After this period, being extensively engaged in his mercantile and agricultural pursuits, he resided at Westport. In his person, Paul Cuffe was tall, well-formed, and athletic, his deportment conciliating, yet dignified and prepossessing, his countenance blending gravity with modesty and sweetness, and firmness with gentleness and humanity, in speech and habit, plain and unostentatious. His whole exterior indicated a man of respectability and piety, and such would a stranger have supposed him to be at first view. His prudence, strengthened by parental care and example, was, no doubt, a safeguard to him in his youth, when exposed to the dissolute company which unavoidably attends a seafaring life, whilst the religion of Jesus Christ, influencing his mind, under the secret guidance of the Holy Spirit of truth, in silent reflection, added, in advancing manhood, to the brightness of his character, and instituted or confirmed his disposition to practical good. He became fully convinced of the principles of truth, as held by the Society of Friends, and uniting himself in membership with them, it pleased the great head of the Church, in whom are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, who respecteth not the persons of men, in his own due time, to entrust him with a gift in the ministry, which he frequently exercised, to the comfort and edification of his friends and brethren. When he was prevented from going abroad, as usual, in the pursuit of his business, on account of the rigors of the winter, he often devoted a considerable portion of his time in teaching navigation to his own sons, and to the young men in the neighborhood in which he resided. And, even on his voyages, when opportunities occurred, he employed himself in imparting a knowledge of this invaluable science to those under him, so that he had the honor of training up, both amongst the white and colored population, a considerable number of skillful navigators. He was careful to maintain a strict integrity and uprightness in all his transactions in trade, and, believing himself to be accountable to God for the mode of using and acquiring his possessions, he was at all times willing, and conceived it to be his bounden duty, as a humble follower of a crucified Lord, to sacrifice his private interests, rather than engage in any enterprise, however lawful in the eyes of the world, or however profitable, that might have a tendency, in the smallest degree, either directly or indirectly, to injure his fellow men. On these grounds, he would not deal in intoxicating liquors or in slaves, though he might have done either, without violating the laws of his country, and with great prospects of pecuniary gain. He turned his attention to the British settlement at Sierra Leone, being induced to believe, from various communications he had received from Europe and other sources, that his endeavors to contribute to its welfare, and to that of his fellow men, might not be ineffectual. On examination, he found his affairs were in so prosperous and flourishing a state as to warrant the undertaking, and, being fully convinced that he was called upon to appropriate a portion of what he had freely received from the hands of an ever bountiful Providence, to the benefit of his unhappy race, he embarked, in the commencement of 1811, in his own brig, Traveller, manned entirely by persons of color, his nephew, Thomas Wayner, being the captain. After a passage of about 2 months, they arrived at Sierra Leone, where Paul remained about the same length of time, during which interval he made himself acquainted with the real state and condition of the colony. He had frequent conversations with the governor and principal inhabitants, during which opportunities he suggested several important improvements. Amongst other things, he recommended the formation of a society for the purpose of promoting the interests of its members and the colonists in general, which measure was immediately acceded to and adopted, and the society named "the Friendly Society of Sierra Leone," composed principally of respectable men of color. Paul Cuffe terminated his labors and his life, which he departed in peace, the 7th of the 9th month, 1817, being then in the 59th year of his age. [Footnote: I am indebted for this account of Paul Cuffe to the address of Rev. Peter Williams, delivered in 1812, and since published in the Liverpool Mercury. Joseph Congdon, Esquire, of New Bedford, has kindly obtained for me the following valuable documents, bearing on Paul Cuffe's exertions in behalf of equal suffrage. To the Honorable Council and House of Representatives, in General Court assembled, for the State of Massachusetts Bay, in New England. The petition of several poor negroes and mulattoes, who are inhabitants of the town of Dartmouth, humbly stoweth. That we, being chiefly of the African extract, and by reason of long bondage and hard slavery, we have been deprived of enjoying the profits of our labor, or the advantage of inheriting estates from our parents, as our neighbors the white people do, having some of us not long enjoyed our own freedom, yet of late, contrary to the invariable custom and practice of the country, we have been, and now are, taxed both in our polls and that small pittance of estate which, through much hard labor and industry, we have got together to sustain ourselves and families withal. We apprehend it, therefore, to be hard usage, and will doubtless, if continued, reduce us to a state of beggary, whereby we shall become a burthen to others, if not timely prevented by the interposition of your justice and power. Your petitioners further show that we apprehend ourselves to be aggrieved, in that, while we are not allowed the privilege of freemen of the state, having no vote or influence in the election of those that tax us, yet many of our color, as is well known, have cheerfully entered the field of battle in the defense of the common cause, and that, as we conceive, against a similar exertion of power, in regard to taxation, too well known to need a recital in this place. We most humbly request, therefore, that you would take our unhappy case into your serious consideration, and in your wisdom and power, grant us relief from taxation, while under our present depressed circumstances, and your poor petitioners, as in duty bound, shall ever pray, etc. John Cuffee, Adventure Child, Paul Cuffe, Samuel Gray, Pero Howland, Pero Russell, Pero Coggeshall. Dated at Dartmouth, the 10th of February, 1780. Memorandum in the handwriting of John Cuffee. This is the copy of the petition which we did deliver unto the Honorable Council and House, for relief from taxation in the days of our distress. But we received none. John Cuffee. There is also a copy of the petition, with the date January 22nd, 1781, not signed, by which it would appear that they intended to renew their application to the government for relief. From the records of Dartmouth, May 10th, 1780. The town, Dartmouth, took in consideration the form of government, etc. The committee recommended that in the 4th article, 25th page, the words, "sui juris, and that pays a poll tax, except such who, from their respective offices and age, are exempted by law," be added after the words, "every male person," and to expunge the following clause in said article, namely, "having a freehold estate within the same town, of the annual income of £3, or any estate of the value of £60, for the following reason: such qualification appears to your committee to be inconsistent with the liberty we are contending for, so long, especially, as any subject, who is not a qualified voter, is obliged to pay a poll tax. Signed, Edward Pope, Chairman. Quote, the report was accepted by a unanimous vote of 150 persons present. End quote. Extract from the town warrant of Dartmouth, dated February 20th, 1781. Quote, to choose an agent or agents to defend an action against John and Paul Cuffee at the next court to be holden at Taunton. End quote. At the meeting, March 8th, 1781. Quote, the Honorable Walter Spooner, Esquire, chose an agent, in behalf of the town, to make answer to John and Paul Cuffee, at the next inferior court to be held at Taunton. End quote. A request. To the selectmen of the town of Dartmouth, greeting. Quote, we the subscribers, your humble petitioners, desire that you would, in your capacity, put a stroke in your next warrant for calling a town meeting, so that it may legally be laid before said town, by way of vote, to know the mind of said town, whether all free negroes and mulattoes shall have the same privileges in this said town of Dartmouth as the white people have, respecting places of profit, choosing of officers, and the like, together with all other privileges, in all cases that shall or may happen, or be brought in this, our said town of Dartmouth. We, your petitioners, as in duty bound, shall ever pray. Signed, John Cuffee and Paul Cuffe. Quote, dated at Dartmouth, the 22nd of the 4th month, 1781. This request bears the following endorsement. Quote, a true copy of the request which John Cuffee and Paul Cuffe delivered unto the selectmen of the town of Dartmouth, for to have all free negroes and mulattoes to be entered equally with the white people, or to have relief granted us jointly from taxation, etc. Given under my hand, John Cuffee. End quote. Dartmouth, June 11th, 1781. Then received of John Cuffee, £8 12 silver money, in full for all John Cuffee's and Paul Cuffee's rates, until this date, also for all my court charges. Received by me, Richard Collins, Constable. Quote, John and Paul Cuffee, of Dartmouth, to Dr. Elijah Dean, of Taunton. To summoning the assessors of Dartmouth to Taunton Court, 24 shillings. On the back, quote, received of John Cuffee, 24 shillings, being the contents of the within accounted, in behalf of Elijah Dean. Signed, Edward Pope. End quote. It was ascertained by these proceedings that taxes must be paid, the receipts being forwarded, and this case, although no action followed in court, settled the right of the colored man to the elective franchise in the state of Massachusetts. Richard Johnson, who married a daughter of Paul Cuffe, resided at New Bedford nearly 50 years. In early life, he was engaged as a mariner and filled every capacity from a cabin boy to a captain. During the War of 1812, he was taken prisoner but was released, after having been confined 6 months. He was distinguished for prudence and sagacity in his business operations, and despite the obstacles that prejudice against color so constantly strewed in his path, he succeeded in his mercantile affairs, accumulated a competency, and retired from business several years since. Mr. Johnson was always ready to extend the hand of relief to his enslaved countrymen, and no one was more ready to assist, according to his ability, in the elevation of his people. He was one of the earliest friends of Mr. Garrison, a subscriber to his paper, from the time the first number was issued in Baltimore, and for several years an efficient agent for the Liberator, and very active in circulating Mr. Garrison's Thoughts on Colonization in 1832. In all the vicissitudes through which the anti-slavery cause has been called to pass, Mr. J. always maintained a straightforward, consistent course, firmly adhering to the pioneer who first sounded the alarm. He died in peace, February 15, 1853, aged 77, and the funeral service of himself and wife, whose death preceded his one day, was numerously attended by New Bedford citizens. Richard Potter. On the Northern New Hampshire Railroad, some 30 miles from Concord, in the town of Andover, is a station called Potter's Place. This little village derives its name from Richard Potter, the celebrated ventriloquist and professor of legerdemain. Within 20 rods of the track stands a neat, white, one-story building, with 2 projecting wings, all of Grecian architecture. From this extends southwesterly a fine expanse of level meadow. This house and the adjacent 200 acres were owned by Richard Potter. There once stood on pillars before the house 2 graven images, taken from Lord Timothy Dexter's place in Newburyport. Potter built the house and cultivated the farm, which were estimated, in the days of Potter, and long before the railroad was built, to be worth $5,000. This Potter owned in fee simple, unencumbered, the fruits of his successful illusions, optical and auricular. Potter was a colored man, halfway between fair and black. He for a long time monopolized the market for such wares as sleight of hand and laborious speaking from the stomach. Says one writer in the Boston Traveler of November 6, 1851. Quote, "We all remember how our astonished eyes first beheld his debut upon the stage, a pretentious-looking magician from India. And then to see him perform, eat tow, spit fire, and draw from his mouth yards and yards of ribbon, all made out of tow, far down in his crop, to hear him command an egg to roll all over him, from head to foot, from foot to head, etc., etc. And then his comic songs. Donning another attire, he would hobble around the stage, an old woman, and the old woman would tell over her various troubles in successive stanzas, always concluding with the cheerful refrain, 'Hows'ever, I keep up a pretty good heart.'" End quote. Richard was born in the town of Hopkinton, Massachusetts, and when quite a boy, was prevailed upon to engage himself in the service of Samuel Dillaway, Esquire, of Boston, a relative of the family, being on a wedding tour to that pleasant town. After being brought up by Mr. Dillaway, he became a valued and esteemed servant in the family of the Reverend Daniel Oliver, of Boston, and in his kitchen he studied out the theory and began the practice of legerdemain. Mr. Oliver's son, late Adjutant General of Massachusetts, often alludes to the winter evening amusements afforded to the children at home by the tricks and pranks of Potter. He who was so successful in these, his first efforts, and so able to set up business on his own account, could not long be retained as a servant. He followed his vocation, ever after, till death arrested him in his course. Columbian Hall and Concert Hall, in the olden time, were the prominent places in Boston for Potter's levees. Potter was temperate, steady, attentive to his business, and his business was his delight. He took as much pleasure in pleasing others as others did in being pleased. I have never heard a lisp against his character for honesty and fair dealing. He was once the victim of persecution from a Mr. Fitch, who had him arrested as a juggler. Potter pled his own case and secured an acquittal. Close by Potter's house, in a small enclosure, stands 2 monumental slabs of white marble, one for his wife, Sally H., the other in memory of Richard Potter, the celebrated ventriloquist, who died September 20th, 1835, aged 52 years. End of chapter 1, part 8.